The grand meeting hall of the Galactic Council sparkled with its usual glory. Floating lights danced near the crystal ceiling, and holographic displays flickered with urgent messages from 100 worlds. But today, the usual calm was nowhere to be found. "They've taken 3 more systems," shouted Council Member Blue, his tentacles waving in distress. The tall, slender alien's normally bright blue skin had turned pale with fear. "Our best weapons didn't even scratch them." Around the circular table, representatives from 50 advanced civilizations shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some had extra arms, others had wings, and a few were just clouds of gas in containment suits. But they all shared the same look of defeat. In the corner, Council Member Tom Smith from Earth sat quietly. Unlike his alien colleagues, he wore a simple black suit instead of the flowing robes most preferred. While others frantically waved their appendages and shouted solutions, he watched the main display with narrowed eyes. The screen showed their enemy, massive crystals, each the size of a small moon, floating through space like hungry predators. Where they passed, they left nothing but empty rocks behind. These crystal beings ate everything: metals, gases, even radiation. 15 worlds had already fallen to them. "We tried the new quantum disruptor," reported Council Member Green, a plant-based being whose leaves drooped with exhaustion. "The crystals absorbed the energy and grew bigger." "The gravity weapons failed too," added another member. "They just adapted and kept coming." Tom Smith watched as more reports came in. The Council had tried everything their advanced technology could offer. Energy weapons failed. Artificial black holes failed. Time distortion fields failed. Nano-weapon swarms failed. Even their most powerful starship fleets all failed. As the panic grew, Smith noticed something interesting in the data. He pulled up the star maps on his personal display, studying the crystal beings' movement patterns. They avoided certain systems, mostly ones that other species called harsh or primitive. "What about the dark star system?" asked one member. "They were headed straight for it yesterday." "Changed course completely," replied another. "Went around it entirely." Smith's eyes lit up. Dark Star was known for its extreme conditions, much like Earth had been before humans tamed it. He started checking other systems the crystals avoided, and a pattern emerged. The Council continued their frantic discussion, each suggestion more desperate than the last. One wanted to evacuate entire sectors of space. Another suggested trying to communicate with the crystals for the 10th time. A third wondered if they could hide entire planets with cloaking technology. Finally, Smith cleared his throat. The simple sound somehow cut through the chaos, and 50 alien heads turned to look at him. Some of them seemed surprised, as if they'd forgotten the human was even there. "I couldn't help but notice," he said, his voice calm and steady, "that these crystals avoid systems with certain natural challenges." "What do you mean?" asked Council Member Blue, all 4 eyes blinking in confusion. Smith stood up and walked to the main display. With a few taps, he highlighted the systems the crystals had avoided. "These places have something in common: extreme temperatures, unstable planetary cores, intense radiation, natural disasters." He paused, letting it sink in. "The kind of things that shaped my species." The council chamber went quiet. They all knew about Earth, the death world that had somehow produced a spacefaring race. Most of them couldn't even visit human planets without heavy protection. "Are you suggesting?" Council Member Green started, then stopped, appearing uncomfortable with the thought. "I'm suggesting," Smith said, "that when advanced technology fails, maybe we need someone who understands more primitive solutions." He smiled slightly. "Someone who evolved on a world that tried to kill them every day. Someone who had to master the basic forces of nature just to survive." The council members looked at each other nervously. They all knew what he meant. They needed a Deathworlder. They needed a human. The silence in the council chamber lasted only moments before the protests began. "Impossible." Council Member Blue's tentacles twisted in horror. "You want to bring in a a combat specialist, like your primitive warriors. Smith stood calmly at the display, hands in his pockets. Not just any combat specialist. He tapped a button, and a new image appeared. I suggest we bring in Captain Jack Miller. The hologram showed a tough-looking human man in his 40s, with a weathered face and alert eyes. His simple military uniform carried minimal decorations, but the scars on his face told their own story. "This is madness," whispered Council Member Green. "His species still uses explosive weapons, physical ammunition, chemical reactions." "Exactly," Smith said with a smile. "When was the last time any of your species had to think about basic physics, about heat, pressure, or impact force?" The aliens looked at each other uncomfortably. Their civilizations had moved past such things centuries ago. Most of their young didn't even study basic science anymore. Their computers handled everything. Smith brought up another display. Captain Miller spent 15 years leading teams in the harshest environments Earth has to offer. Volcanic regions, Arctic wastelands, deep ocean trenches, places that would kill most of you in seconds. The display showed video clips. Miller leading teams through burning deserts, climbing ice walls, surviving in deep caves. The council members watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. But what could he possibly do against the crystal beings? Asked a gaseous council member floating in their containment suit. "They resist our most advanced weapons." "Tell me," Smith said, "what happens to a crystal when you heat it up very quickly and then cool it down just as fast?" "It breaks, of course," answered Council Member Blue. But his tentacles suddenly went still as understanding hit him. "Oh, simple physics," Smith continued. "Something every human learns in basic school. Something we had to master to survive on Earth." He looked around the room. "When's the last time any of your species had to worry about things like thermal shock?" More understanding faces around the room now. Their advanced technology had protected them from such basic forces for so long, they'd forgotten about them. The main doors opened, and Captain Miller himself walked in. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced death many times and lived to tell about it. His boots, actual physical boots, not gravity generators, made soft sounds on the polished floor. "Council members," he said, nodding respectfully, "I've reviewed the situation." His voice was steady, practical. No panic, no fear, just calm analysis. He walked to the display and brought up an image of the crystal beings. "These things are basically space rocks, right? Big, smart, mean space rocks, but still rocks." He grinned. "And humans, we've been breaking rocks since we first picked up a stone tool." Several council members shifted uneasily at this reminder of humanity's violent past. "Captain Miller," Council Member Green asked cautiously, "what exactly would you do?" "Simple," Miller replied. "We hit them where they're weak. Not with fancy energy beams or quantum fields. We use basic forces: heat, cold, pressure, impact." He pointed to different parts of the crystal being structure. "Everything has a breaking point. We just need to find theirs." "This is prehistoric thinking," protested one member. "Exactly," Miller said. "Sometimes you need to think old to solve new problems. These crystals evolved somewhere, probably in calm, stable conditions. They've never faced a species that evolved on a death world. They've never faced humans." Smith watched with satisfaction as the council members began to nod slowly. Sometimes the oldest solutions were the best ones. Sometimes you needed someone who understood the basic forces of nature, someone whose ancestors had survived a world that tried to kill them every day. Sometimes you needed a Deathworlder. And Captain Miller was ready to prove why. Captain Miller sat in the council's main science lab, surrounded by holograms of the crystal beings. He hadn't slept in 20 hours, but his eyes remained sharp and focused. Next to him, 3 alien scientists watched nervously as he did something they found strange. He was writing notes by hand, on actual paper. "Look at this," Miller said, pointing to a recording of a crystal being splitting into two. They're following the same patterns as Earth crystals, just bigger and smarter. The head scientist, Dr. Bright, floated closer in his anti-gravity chair. We've studied their energy patterns for weeks. They're far too complex to be simple crystals. Miller smiled. Complex doesn't mean different. Ice is just frozen water, but it can make beautiful patterns. These things are space crystals, but they still follow basic rules. He stood up and walked to a large display showing a crystal being attacking a planet. The massive creature was breaking down everything it touched into raw materials. But Miller noticed something everyone else had missed. "Stop the video," he ordered. "Now play it at 1/10 speed." The footage slowed down. Miller pointed at the crystal's surface. "There. See that crack? It happened when the planet's defense system hit it with cold plasma." "But the crack healed instantly," Dr. Bright said. "Yes," Miller agreed, "but it still cracked. And look, it changed course slightly after that hit. It felt pain, or whatever these things feel. It was trying to avoid more damage." The alien scientists looked at each other. The idea that such advanced beings could feel simple physical pain hadn't occurred to them. Miller pulled up more footage. Every time they feed, they'd follow the same pattern. They absorb energy and matter in specific directions, just like crystal growth on Earth. He grabbed a glass of water from his desk. "Watch this." He poured a few drops of salt water onto a flat surface and let it evaporate. The aliens watched in confusion as tiny crystals formed. "Basic crystal formation," Miller explained. "They grow in patterns. They have weak points. They can break." He looked at the giant crystal beings on the screen. "These space crystals are doing the same thing, just on a massive scale." One of the younger scientists, still wearing training badges, spoke up. "But our weapons—" "Your weapons are too advanced," Miller interrupted. "You're trying to destroy them with energy they can absorb and use. It's like trying to kill a fire by feeding it more wood." He pulled out something from his pocket, a simple piece of quartz crystal. With a quick motion, he heated the crystal with a lighter, then dropped it into his cold water. The crystal cracked with a sharp sound. The aliens jumped back in surprise. "Thermal shock," Miller explained. "Basic physics. Heat something up fast, cool it down fast. It breaks. No fancy technology needed, just simple science that every human kid learns in school." He turned back to the main display. "These crystal beings have never faced this kind of attack. They evolved in deep space, where temperature changes happen slowly. They've never had to deal with sudden, extreme changes." Dr. Bright's eyes widened. "You want to use thermal shock? On that scale?" Miller nodded. "Among other things, pressure changes, sonic vibrations, physical impacts at their weak points. Basic forces that they can't adapt to because they've never needed to." He pulled up a map of the crystal beings' movements. "Look where they avoid. Systems with variable stars, unstable planets, extreme conditions. They're afraid of exactly what made humans strong. A harsh, changing environment." The scientists began to understand. Their advanced technology had failed because it was too complex. The solution wasn't to go more advanced. It was to go back to basics. "We'll need to run tests," Miller said. "Small scale first, then bigger. But I'm certain about one thing." He looked at the massive crystal beings on the screen. "These things have never faced a species that evolved throwing rocks at their food. They've never faced humans." The alien scientists watched as Miller began drawing up plans. For the first time since the crisis began, they felt something new. Hope. The Council's main hangar had never seen anything like this before. Instead of sleek spaceships and energy weapons, it was filled with what looked like giant mining equipment and massive containers of simple chemicals. The alien workers watched in confusion as human engineers moved with purpose, setting up what they called primitive weapons. Captain Miller stood at the center of the chaos, directing his team. "Put the thermal charges over there," he called out to a group of workers, "and be careful with those liquid nitrogen tanks." Council Member Blue slithered up to Miller, all four eyes wide with concern. "Captain, are you sure about using such dangerous materials? One mistake could blow us all up?" Miller finished with a grin. "That's why we're being careful. Besides, sometimes you need to risk a little danger to get the job done." His team was a mix of Earth's best: demolition experts who had taken down mountains, deep sea miners who understood pressure, and geologists who knew everything about breaking rocks. Each one had been chosen for their experience with basic forces of nature. At one end of the hangar, Linda Martinez, his explosives expert, was testing what she called her special mix. She had crushed a small crystal similar to the space beings and was trying different combinations of heat and cold on it. "Boss," she called out, "you need to see this." Miller walked over as Linda held up a broken crystal. "Watch," she said, putting another crystal in a test chamber. She hit it with intense heat for 3 seconds, then instantly sprayed it with liquid nitrogen. The crystal didn't just crack, it shattered completely. "Perfect," Miller said. "How fast can we make bigger versions?" "Give me 12 hours and lots of coffee," Linda replied with a smile. Across the hangar, Tom Walker, the geology expert, was working with alien scientists to build what he called resonance hammers, devices that could create specific vibrations to weaken crystal structures. The aliens were amazed at how simple, yet clever, the design was. "It's like an earthquake in a box," Walker explained to the confused aliens. "On Earth, we learned the hard way what certain vibrations can do to solid structures." Miller checked his tablet, looking at the latest scans of the approaching crystal beings. They had taken another system yesterday, but they were moving slower now, almost like they could sense something was different. "Captain," a voice called from above. Miller looked up to see Amy Rogers, his space warfare specialist, hanging from a scaffold where she was modifying a ship's hull. "We've got the delivery system working. These babies can take a beating and still get close enough to plant the charges." The delivery system was another primitive solution: heavily armored ships designed to ram straight into the crystal beings. The alien engineers had been horrified by the idea, but they couldn't argue with the logic. Sometimes the simplest approach was the best one. Council Member Smith walked in, looking at the progress with satisfaction. "The Council is concerned about your methods, Captain," he said, "but they're more afraid of the crystals. You have their approval to proceed." Miller nodded. "Good, because we're almost ready." He turned to address his entire team. "Listen up, everyone. Final checks in 2 hours. We launch in 6. This is what we trained for." The humans cheered while the aliens watched in a mixture of fear and amazement. They couldn't understand how these Deathworlders could be so excited about such a dangerous mission. As the team returned to work with renewed energy, Miller looked at the star map showing the crystal being's location. Everything they needed was ready. Thermal shock weapons, check. Pressure bombs, check. Resonance hammers, check. Modified ships, check. Brave crews who understood what they were facing, check. "They won't know what hit them," Miller said quietly. "Sometimes the old ways are the best ways." Smith smiled. "The Council thinks you're all crazy, you know." "Maybe we are," Miller replied. "But we're the kind of crazy that gets results. Besides," he added with a grin, "if being sane means letting those crystals eat more worlds, I'll take crazy any day." The final preparations continued as the countdown to launch began. Soon, the crystal beings would learn why you should never underestimate humans and their primitive solutions. The fleet of modified human ships moved silently through space. Unlike the sleek alien vessels, these ships looked rough and primitive, covered in thick armor and carrying what looked like giant mining equipment. Captain Miller stood on the bridge of the lead ship, watching as they approached their target. "Crystal being detected at Mark 227, reported Linda from her station. "It's big, about the size of Earth's moon." Through the main window, they could see it, a massive crystalline structure floating in space, its surface gleaming with absorbed energy. Beautiful, but deadly. They had watched recordings of these beings destroying worlds, but seeing one in person was different. All ships maintain radio silence, Miller ordered. Remember your training. These things can sense energy weapons, but they've never dealt with what we're bringing. The crystal being hadn't noticed them yet. Their ships, running on minimal power and covered in sensor-blocking materials, were practically invisible to its usual detection methods. This was their first advantage, the element of surprise. Team 1, you're up, Miller said quietly. 2 ships broke formation, moving to flank the crystal being. Inside each ship, crews prepared their primitive weapons. The aliens had laughed at these weapons during testing. Now it was time to prove them wrong. In position, came the whispered report. Miller took a deep breath. Execute Plan Rockbreaker. The 2 ships suddenly fired their engines at full power, racing toward the crystal being from opposite sides. At the same time, they launched their first weapons, massive containers of liquid nitrogen, followed immediately by plasma bombs. The effect was instant and dramatic. Where the liquid nitrogen hit, the crystal's surface froze in seconds. Before it could adapt, the plasma bombs struck the same spots, creating an extreme temperature change. The crystal being's surface didn't just crack. Entire sections shattered into space. A high-pitched screech echoed through space. The crystal was actually screaming. It works, Linda shouted, forgetting radio silence in her excitement. The thermal shock is working. The crystal being tried to respond, sending out energy beams that had destroyed so many alien ships. But the human vessels, with their thick armor and minimal electronics, barely noticed the attacks. Team 2, you're up, Miller ordered. Hit it with the resonance hammers. 3 more ships moved in, each carrying devices that Tom had designed. They attached to the crystal's surface and started vibrating at specific frequencies. More cracks appeared, spreading like spider webs across the massive structure. It's trying to run, someone reported. Miller smiled grimly. Not today. Team 3 cut off its retreat. The final group of ships moved into position, launching specialized bombs that exploded into clouds of superheated plasma, then instantly cooled to near absolute zero. The crystal being was trapped in a cage of thermal shock. From the Council's observation ship, safely distant, the alien representatives watched in amazement. Their advanced weapons had failed for months, but these primitive human weapons were tearing the crystal being apart. How? Council Member Blue asked, his tentacles twisting in confusion. How is this possible? Smith, standing beside him, explained. Because sometimes the simplest solution is the best solution. These beings never evolved to handle rapid temperature changes or specific vibrations. They never had to. But humans, we learned about these forces the hard way, on a world that tried to kill us every day. On Miller's ship, Linda's console lit up with new readings. Captain, the crystal structure is failing. Core temperature dropping rapidly. All ships, pull back to safe distance, Miller ordered. Let's watch what happens when you push a crystal past its breaking point. The human ships retreated as the massive crystal being began to collapse. The cracks spread faster, deeper, until finally, with a silent flash of light, it shattered into millions of pieces. For a moment, everyone was quiet. Then cheers erupted across all channels. First test successful, Miller reported to the Council ship. We now know how to kill them. He looked at the drifting crystal fragments and smiled. And this was just one ship. Wait until they see what our whole fleet can do. The Council members could only watch in stunned silence as the humans celebrated their victory. They had called for a Deathworlder, and a Deathworlder had delivered. This was just the beginning. The news of the first crystal being's destruction spread fast across the galaxy. Within days, Earth had sent its entire fleet of modified ships. Captain Miller stood in the Council's main command center, looking at a huge map showing hundreds of crystal beings moving through space. They're gathering, Linda reported, pointing to a cluster of red dots. Looks like they finally realized we're a threat. The crystal beings had changed their behavior. Instead of spreading out to consume more worlds, they were coming together, thousands of massive crystals, forming what looked like a giant sparkling wall in space. They're learning, Miller said. Good. That means they can feel fear. The command center was packed with representatives from 50 worlds. All eyes were on the humans. The Council had given Earth full control of the operation after seeing their first success. All ships report ready, Tom announced from his station. We've equipped every vessel in the combined fleet with our weapons. The alien ships have been modified too. Their fancy energy weapons replaced with what Miller called proper planet cracker gear. Some alien crews were still nervous about using such basic weapons, but they couldn't argue with the results. Message from the crystal beings. An alien communications officer reported. They're broadcasting on simple radio waves. Miller raised an eyebrow. Put it through. A harsh, grinding sound filled the room. After a moment, it formed into words. We are ETRNL. We CAN and OTB stopid by primitive forces. Want to bet? Miller muttered. He pressed a button on his command console. All ships. This is Captain Miller. Remember your training. Remember what we learned on Earth. These things think they're unstoppable because they've never faced anyone who understands basic physics. Let's show them how wrong they are. The human fleet led the charge, with alien ships following in formation. As they approached the crystal wall, the beings started their usual attack, energy beams that could tear apart normal ships. But these weren't normal ships anymore. First wave, deploy thermal charges, Miller ordered. Hundreds of ships launched their weapons. Massive containers of liquid nitrogen crashed into the crystal wall, instantly freezing huge sections. Before the crystals could adapt, plasma bombs hit the same spots. The sound of cracking and shattering filled space. Second wave, resonance hammers. Tom's devices attached to the weakened crystal surfaces, sending specific vibrations deep into their structure. The crystal beings tried to merge together for protection, but this only made things worse. The vibrations traveled through their combined form, creating even more cracks. They're trying to retreat, Linda shouted. Third wave cut them off. The alien ships, now confident in their new weapons, moved to surround the crystal beings. They created a massive cage of thermal shock zones, trapping the crystals in an area where the temperature changed from extreme heat to extreme cold in seconds. The crystal beings tried to adapt, tried to absorb the energy as they had always done. But they couldn't handle these rapid changes. They had evolved in the stable conditions of deep space, never facing anything like this. They're breaking, someone shouted. The massive crystal wall was falling apart. Huge sections shattered into space, while others crumbled under their own weight. The beings tried to communicate again, but their radio message was just confused static. All ships, final attack pattern. Miller ordered. Hit them with everything. Every ship in the combined fleet fired at once. Thermal charges, resonance hammers, pressure bombs, all the primitive weapons hit together. The effect was devastating. The crystal wall didn't just break, it exploded. Billions of crystal fragments scattered across space, sparkling like a massive cloud of diamonds. The command center erupted in cheers. Aliens and humans celebrated together as the threat that had terrified the galaxy for months was finally destroyed. Status report. Miller called out over the noise. 87% of the crystal beings confirmed destroyed. Linda reported. The rest are scattered and breaking apart. They're finished, Captain. Miller nodded, looking at the victory display. Humans had just saved the galaxy using what the aliens called primitive methods. Basic physics and simple forces had succeeded where advanced technology had failed. Send word to all worlds, he ordered. The crystal threat is over. And remind everyone, sometimes the old ways are the best ways. The celebration continued as the fleet began cleanup operations. The galaxy was safe. thanks to some primitive humans who remembered their roots. 1 month after the Great Crystal Battle, the Galactic Council chamber looked very different. Gone were the fancy energy displays and floating holograms. Instead, simple physical models and basic science demonstrations filled the room. At the main table, Captain Miller stood before the council, finishing his final report. "The last crystal fragments have been collected," he said, holding up a small container of glittering dust. "Our scientists are studying them. Turns out they're not so scary when they're sample-sized." Council Member Blue, who had once doubted the primitive human methods, raised a tentacle. "Captain, the council has voted. We're creating a new department, the Basic Forces Division. We want you to lead it." Miller looked surprised. "You want me to teach others about primitive warfare?" "Not just warfare," Council Member Smith added with a smile. "We've realized something important. In our rush to advance technology, we forgot the basic forces that shape our universe. The crystal beings nearly destroyed us because we didn't remember simple physics." Around the chamber, alien representatives nodded in agreement. The battle had changed their view of primitive knowledge. Now, many worlds were asking Earth to send teachers. Linda and Tom entered the chamber, carrying boxes of equipment. They had spent the last week showing alien scientists how thermal shock and vibration weapons worked. The aliens, once disgusted by such basic tools, now took careful notes. "Look at this," Tom said, setting up a simple demonstration. He took a crystal, heated it quickly, then cooled it. The crystal cracked perfectly. Basic physics. Works every time. The alien scientists watched in fascination. One of them spoke up. "We've added basic science courses to our schools again. Our children need to understand these principles, not just rely on computers." Miller walked to the main window, looking out at the ships in orbit. The fleet had changed. Alongside the sleek alien vessels, sturdy human-style ships now patrolled space. Some aliens had even started calling them practical ships instead of primitive ones. "There's something else," Council Member Green announced. "We're opening new research stations on harsh worlds. Like Earth, we need to understand how to survive in difficult conditions." "Deathworlder training?" Miller asked with a grin. "Exactly," Smith replied. "The galaxy needs to remember what your people never forgot, that understanding basic forces makes us stronger." Linda brought out her tablet, showing images from across the galaxy. Alien crews training with human teams, scientists studying Earth's geology, military units learning about thermal shock and pressure waves. The changes were everywhere. "The crystal beings taught us a valuable lesson," Council Member Blue said. "Advanced technology is wonderful, but we can't forget the basic principles. We can't forget what we learned in our early days." Miller nodded. "On Earth, we have a saying, know your roots. We never stopped teaching basic science alongside advanced technology. That's why we survived on our harsh world. That's why we could fight the crystals." The council members looked at each other, then made an unprecedented move. They stood up, all of them, and bowed to the human team. "Thank you," they said together, "for remembering what we forgot." Miller felt proud, but he also felt hopeful. The galaxy was changing. The word primitive wasn't an insult anymore. It was a reminder. A reminder that sometimes the simplest solution was the best solution. "So," he said, looking at his new alien students, "who's ready to learn some basic physics?" The room filled with raised hands, tentacles, and other appendages. Even the most advanced species wanted to learn the old ways now. As Miller began his first lesson, he smiled. Humans had saved the galaxy not with fancy technology, but with simple knowledge that any high school student on Earth would know. They had proven that being a Deathworlder, being primitive, wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. And now, the whole galaxy understood why sometimes, when nothing else works, you call a Deathworlder. Because Deathworlders remember the basics. They remember what works.